It was an ordinary Sunday afternoon when Emma decided to snap a family photo. The day was calm, the air crisp with a slight chill typical of early autumn, and the house was full of the usual activity that came with raising quadruplets. Emma's 4 children, Ethan, Emma Jr., Olivia, and Noah, were all under 5 years old, and though they were a handful, they brought a kind of joy to the household that made every challenge seem worthwhile. Emma, a 32-year-old stay-at-home mom, had grown used to the whirlwind that came with having 4 kids at once. There were sleepless nights, endless bottles, and the constant juggling of demands, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. Her husband, Daniel, worked long hours at a law firm in the city, so Sundays were Emma's time to handle things on her own. But today was different. Today, she felt compelled to capture the moment. The children were all in their best Sunday clothes, their hair combed neatly, and their faces glowing with innocence. It was the perfect opportunity for a family picture. She set up her phone on a tripod, carefully arranging the children around her for a more organized shot. Olivia, the most outgoing of the bunch, sat eagerly in front, flashing a bright smile. Ethan and Emma Jr., both energetic and playful, were busy squirming around, but Noah, ever the quiet one, sat perfectly still next to her. Emma, feeling a surge of love for her little ones, adjusted the phone and stepped into the frame. The family's living room, a cozy space with light-colored walls and large windows, offered the perfect backdrop. Outside, golden sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating a soft, natural glow. Emma smiled as she stood next to her kids. She pressed the shutter button on her phone, and the camera captured the image. It was a perfect shot, or so she thought. The photo sat on Emma's phone for a few days, and it was nothing out of the ordinary. She posted it to her social media accounts, as any proud mother would. There were the usual comments: "What a beautiful family. Look at those adorable kids. Emma, you're such a great mom." She responded with gratitude, basking in the fleeting attention that came from a post like this. After all, it was just another snapshot in the seemingly endless collection of family memories. But then something strange happened. The post started to gain more attention than Emma had expected. People she hadn't spoken to in years began commenting, liking, and sharing the photo. At first, Emma assumed it was just the novelty of her children's adorable faces getting attention, but as the likes and shares kept pouring in, something began to feel off. She glanced through the comments, some of them more curious than kind. Then, one comment caught her attention. Did anyone else notice that in the background of the photo? It was from a friend of a friend, someone she didn't even know very well. At first, Emma didn't think much of it, but curiosity got the best of her. She opened the photo and zoomed in, her heart racing for no particular reason. There, in the far corner of the picture, just barely visible, was something that shouldn't have been there. The object was small, hidden behind the large vase of flowers that sat on the side table in the background. At first glance, it seemed like an odd shadow or perhaps a trick of the light. But the more Emma stared, the more she realized that it was something far more sinister, an object, or perhaps a person, lurking in the background, partially obscured, as though it had been intentionally placed just out of sight. Emma's stomach dropped as the implications of what she was seeing began to set in. She zoomed in further, squinting at the details. A figure, unmistakably human, appeared to be standing near the window behind the family. The person was partly concealed by the flower arrangement, but the shape and posture were unmistakable. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the photo again and again, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. How had she missed this before? What was going on? Panic began to rise within her. She knew the house had been quiet during the photo, but had anyone been in the room at that time? No. She was sure of it. She and her kids had been alone in the living room, and Daniel had been in his home office, working. But still, the figure was there, and the more Emma stared at it, the more she felt a sense of dread creeping in. It didn't make sense. The comments section of the post exploded as more people zoomed in on the photo, each of them remarking on the strange figure. "Is that someone standing in the background?" one person asked. "What's going on here?" another commented. "That's creepy," someone else said. People were sharing the image, tagging friends, and speculating about what they were seeing. Emma's phone was flooded with messages, notifications, and comments. Each ping added to her mounting anxiety. She immediately called Daniel, her voice shaking with fear. "Daniel, something's wrong. I need you to look at the photo," she said, trying to stay calm. She sent him the image, and within moments, he replied. "What is that?" he asked, his tone uneasy. "I don't know," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I swear, no one was in the room when I took it. It's just me and the kids." Daniel came home early from work that day. His mind raced with questions. He stared at the photo, trying to make sense of it. Could it be someone in the reflection of the window? He suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma shook her head. "No, the window was covered with a curtain. There's no way that's possible." The tension in the room grew. The more they tried to rationalize the image, the more unsettling it became. Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't understand it, and neither could Daniel. Over the next few days, Emma's phone buzzed non-stop. News of the mysterious figure in the photo spread like wildfire. Local friends, family members, and even strangers from out of town began messaging her. Some were concerned, others were skeptical. But many were curious, asking if the figure had been placed there intentionally. Theories began to spiral. Some suggested it was a trick of the light. Others said it was some kind of ghost or supernatural presence. A few even joked about it being a hidden camera, set up to create a viral sensation. But Emma wasn't laughing. The house had never felt the same since the photo was taken. Emma kept replaying the events of that afternoon in her mind, trying to remember every detail of the moments leading up to the photo. Had she heard anything unusual? Had someone entered the room when she wasn't looking? She couldn't recall any instance of another person being in the living room. And yet, there it was, the figure, still standing in the background of the photo, like a ghostly presence that couldn't be explained away. Soon, more people began showing up at Emma's door, curious about the mystery. They came with cameras, looking to take their own version of the infamous photo, or to offer their own theories on what had happened. Her neighbors, who had once been friendly and kind, started to distance themselves. Some were frightened, others felt that the photo was a sign of something much larger than Emma could ever have imagined. Soon, the local media got wind of the story, and it went from being a small-town mystery to something of national intrigue. The attention was overwhelming. What had begun as a simple, innocent photo had transformed into something much more sinister. Emma's peaceful life had been thrown into chaos. The comments kept coming, the questions kept piling up, and Emma felt herself becoming more and more isolated. Every time she opened her phone, she saw the photo staring back at her, the figure still there, lurking in the background. As the hours passed and the comments continued to flood in, Emma realized that there was no going back. The moment that simple family photo was posted, everything had changed. Her life, her family, her community, all of it was about to be shaken to its core. And the worst part? She had no idea what was coming next. Friends and acquaintances began to distance themselves, unsure of how to react. It wasn't just the mystery of the photo that unsettled them, it was the strange energy that had come with it. Some were genuinely worried for Emma, offering their support and trying to reassure her that it was just a fluke. Others, however, were skeptical, casting doubt on her version of events. Some even started to insinuate that she had staged the photo to get attention. Emma was torn between her instinct to shut everything out and her need to defend herself, to prove that she hadn't fabricated the image. One evening, just as Emma was beginning to feel the weight of it all, Daniel came home earlier than usual. His face was grim as he walked through the door, and Emma could tell that something was off. He handed her a letter, the envelope bearing the logo of the local newspaper. Emma opened it with trembling hands. The letter was an invitation to be interviewed about the photo, to share her side of the story in the hopes of clearing the air. But the tone of the letter was different from the usual polite offers she had received from reporters. There was a sense of urgency to it, a sense that they wanted something from her that she wasn't ready to give. "I don't want to do this," Emma said, her voice small. "I don't know if I can handle more people poking around in our lives. It's too much." Daniel nodded, but there was an air of frustration about him, a tension that had been growing ever since the photo went viral. He had always been the level-headed one, the one who could take a step back and look at a situation logically. But lately, Emma had noticed the subtle changes in him. He was more distracted, more distant. The photo, it seemed, had affected him just as much as it had affected her. "We can't keep hiding from this, Emma," he said quietly. "It's not going to go away, and the more we try to ignore it, the worse it will get. People will start talking, and we'll lose control of the narrative." Emma felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. It wasn't just the photo, it was everything, the pressure to keep up appearances, to maintain a sense of normalcy in the face of something so inexplicable. She had tried to protect her children from the chaos, to shield them from the media attention and the growing unease in the community. But she couldn't protect them forever. The photo had become a part of their lives now, a part of their story. The next day, Emma received a call from the editor of the local newspaper. The conversation was brief, but the message was clear: they wanted an exclusive interview, one that would put an end to all the rumors and speculation. Emma hesitated, but after a long, quiet moment, she agreed. "I'll do it," she said, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she felt like she had no other choice, or maybe it was because the thought of confronting the mystery head-on gave her a sense of control. Later that week, the interview took place. Emma sat across from the reporter, her hands shaking as she recounted the events of that day, the photo, the strange figure in the background, the flood of attention that followed. She tried to explain that she had no idea who or what was in that photo, but her words felt hollow, as though the more she spoke, the less anyone believed her. The reporter pushed her for answers, asking pointed questions about the origins of the photo, about whether she had any history of paranormal experiences, about her family's past. Each question felt like a trap, and Emma found herself growing more defensive with each passing minute. She wasn't prepared for this, not in the way the reporter seemed to expect. She wasn't prepared for the sudden rush of judgment that came with every question. When the interview was over, Emma felt drained, as though the weight of the world had been placed on her shoulders. As she left the newspaper office, she could see the reporter's eyes on her, could feel the lingering gaze of everyone in the small lobby. It wasn't the kind of attention she wanted. It was the kind that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, as though her life was now part of a spectacle for the whole town to scrutinize. The days that followed were no better. The local media kept running the story, the speculation continued to spread, and the community seemed more divided than ever. Emma's once friendly neighbors had started to act differently, some whispered behind her back, while others gave her polite but distant smiles. The sense of familiarity that had once existed between them had disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The photo had broken something inside the community, a subtle shift in the way people looked at one another. One evening, as Emma sat in the living room with her children, a knock at the door interrupted the stillness. It was a group of her neighbors, standing in a line outside. At first, Emma felt a wave of relief, maybe they had come to offer support, to clear the air. But as she opened the door, she realized it wasn't the warmth of friendship she had expected. Instead, the group stood there, tense and silent, their expressions uncertain. The silence was deafening, and Emma felt a lump form in her throat. Finally, one of them spoke. "Emma, we need to talk," she said, her voice cold. "This photo, it's not just about you anymore. It's about all of us. People are talking, and we need to know if you're hiding something. Emma's heart sank. The photo had taken on a life of its own, and now, it wasn't just her secret, it was the town's secret. Everything she had known, everything she had believed about the safety of her home, had been shattered. The mystery of the photo had become a reflection of something much deeper, something buried within the heart of Cedar Valley. And as the weight of their words settled in, Emma realized that the life she had once known was gone. What came next, she couldn't be sure. But one thing was certain, the world she had built was on the verge of crumbling, and the secrets that lay beneath the surface were about to come to light. The next few days were a blur for Emma. The knock on her door from her neighbors had set off a chain of events that she hadn't fully anticipated, but she knew in her gut that it marked the beginning of something much bigger than the photo itself. The atmosphere in Cedar Valley had shifted. Where once there had been a sense of calm, a comforting normalcy, now there was a prevailing tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. People no longer exchanged smiles or friendly hellos. The familiar faces of neighbors seemed unfamiliar now, their expressions filled with judgment or curiosity, as if they were all waiting for the next big revelation. And Emma was at the center of it all. When she closed the door after her conversation with the group of neighbors, she felt a chill run down her spine. Their words lingered in the air, echoing in her mind. People are talking, Emma. What was it they were talking about? What did they know, or think they knew, about her family? The photo, which had started as a simple snapshot of a moment in time, had grown into a viral sensation, a symbol of mystery that no one in the town could ignore. That night, Emma sat alone in her living room after putting the children to bed, staring at the phone in her hands. It buzzed intermittently with more messages, more comments, but she was numb to it now. It was the same old questions, the same old speculation. Every time she opened her social media, she could feel her anxiety rising. Strangers from all over were now weighing in on her life, offering opinions and theories about the figure in the background of the photo. Some said it was a ghost, a haunting from the past, while others claimed it was simply a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the curtain. The more she tried to explain herself, the more tangled the web became. She couldn't keep up with the lies and assumptions. But then, one message stood out. It wasn't from a stranger, nor was it from someone in town. It was from her aunt, Mary, who lived out of state. Mary was someone Emma hadn't spoken to much in recent years, but they had always shared a close bond when Emma was younger. The message was simple but urgent. I need to talk to you. Call me when you can. The words themselves weren't alarming, but the tone was unmistakable. Something wasn't right. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she dialed her aunt's number. Emma, Mary said softly when she picked up. I don't know how to say this, but I think I know what's going on with that photo. Emma's mind raced. Her aunt's voice was filled with a mixture of concern and something else, something Emma couldn't quite place, but it made her feel uneasy. What do you mean? Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. I don't want to scare you, but I've been hearing things, reading some of the comments online. People are saying it's a ghost, and I know that sounds ridiculous, but I think there's more to it than that. There's something in your past, Emma, something I've never told you about. Something that I should have told you a long time ago. Emma felt her blood run cold. Her aunt's cryptic words stirred something deep inside her. She had always known that there were things about her family's past that no one talked about, but she had never dared to ask. She had grown up hearing fragments of stories, vague references to relatives who had passed away before she was born or who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But Emma had always shrugged it off, thinking it was just the way families were. Some things remained private, unspoken. What do you mean? Emma repeated, her voice trembling now. What do you know? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Emma could hear her aunt's deep breath. Emma, you need to listen carefully. Your great-grandmother, Clara, she was involved in something that she never spoke of. People used to say that Clara had a gift. She could see things that weren't supposed to be seen. Your mother, when she was young, used to tell me about strange occurrences in the house. She said she saw things moving on their own, heard voices, and once, she swore she saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. I always thought she was imagining things, but now, with this photo, I'm not so sure. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The name Clara struck a chord in her, a name she had heard whispered in her family's history, but never discussed in detail. She had always thought it was just an old family story, nothing more than a strange tale that older relatives liked to tell at gatherings. But now, her aunt was suggesting something entirely different, something far more sinister. Why didn't you tell me this before? Emma asked, feeling a mixture of anger and confusion. Why are you telling me this now? I didn't want to scare you, Emma, Mary replied, her voice filled with regret. But this photo, it's connected to her. I'm sure of it. Clara had a way of drawing attention to herself, and people in the town thought she was involved in strange rituals, things that were never talked about openly. I don't know the full story, but I think it's time you learned the truth. The figure in that photo, it could be a sign. It could be tied to whatever Clara was a part of. The weight of her aunt's words settled heavily on Emma's chest. She had always thought of her family as ordinary, like any other family in Cedar Valley, but now, it seemed that there was a darker side to her lineage that she had never known. She needed answers, but where would she even begin to look? Her aunt had mentioned a gift that Clara had possessed, but the implications of that seemed too far-fetched. Ghosts, rituals, gifts, none of it felt real to Emma, and yet, the figure in the background of the photo was proof that something was not right. Do you think this is about Clara? Emma asked, her voice shaky. Do you think the photo is connected to her? I don't know, Mary replied, her voice faltering. But I think it's time you found out. You need to learn everything you can about Clara and what happened in that house. It's the only way to make sense of what's going on. Emma sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling. Her aunt's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a family secret that had remained hidden for generations. She didn't know what to think, but she knew one thing: she had to find out the truth. She had to understand what was going on, not just for herself, but for her children. The figure in the photo, whatever it was, wasn't just a mystery to be solved, it was a danger that had somehow found its way into their lives. And Emma had to stop it before it consumed everything. The following morning, Emma called the town's historical society. She had no idea where to start, but the local records seemed like the logical place to begin. She needed to know more about Clara, about her great-grandmother's life and the events that had shaped her family's history. The town's historical society was housed in an old building near the center of Cedar Valley, a place that had always seemed timeless, frozen in the past. Emma had never visited before, but today, it felt like her only hope for answers. When she arrived, an older woman named Mrs. Wilkins greeted her at the door. Mrs. Wilkins had worked at the Historical Society for as long as Emma could remember, and her presence in the town was as much a part of Cedar Valley as the buildings themselves. Mrs. Wilkins had a way of speaking that made everything sound important, as though the smallest detail held a secret waiting to be uncovered. "What can I help you with today, Miss Emma?" Mrs. Wilkins asked, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. Emma hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain her quest. "I need to find information about my great-grandmother, Clara," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of questions swirling inside her. "Anything you have on her, anything at all." Mrs. Wilkins didn't seem surprised. She nodded knowingly, as though she had been expecting Emma's visit. "Clara, you say? Well, you're in luck. We have some old records on her. Let me show you what we have." As they walked to the back of the room, Emma couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The old bookshelves were lined with dusty tomes, yellowed papers, and faded photographs. The air smelled of history, of things long forgotten. And as Emma sifted through the papers Mrs. Wilkins handed her, she began to feel a sense of unease settle in. There were stories about Clara that Emma had never heard before, things her family had clearly kept hidden from her. And the more she read, the more it became clear that the photo, the figure, and the secrets of her past were all connected in ways she couldn't yet understand. But Emma was determined to uncover the truth. And as she read on, she realized that the history of her family, and the mystery surrounding that photo, was only just beginning to unfold. The following weeks felt like an endless unraveling of a mystery that Emma had never signed up for. The more she dug into her family's past, the more she realized that the strange figure in the photo was not some fleeting oddity or random trick of the light, it was a symptom of something much darker, something embedded deep within the history of Cedar Valley, and perhaps even within her own bloodline. The first moment of clarity came the night Emma sat in front of her old family photo albums, long forgotten on a shelf in the back of the closet, as she flipped through pages of pictures her mother had kept. She wasn't prepared for the sight of her great-grandmother Clara's portrait. Clara had a face that commanded attention, strong features, a defiant look in her eyes, but there was something else. Something unsettling. In the photograph, Clara stood next to an older, austere man, whom Emma recognized as the town's former sheriff, though she couldn't immediately place why they were so closely associated. The man's face was just as unyielding as Clara's, yet there was something about his expression, a certain shadow that made Emma's stomach churn. Clara stood tall beside him, her posture straight, her expression one of confidence bordering on arrogance. What Emma found most unnerving, however, was the absence of her great-grandmother's smile. Clara's gaze was direct, almost piercing, as if she was aware of something that the rest of the world could not see. It struck Emma immediately. Clara's eyes were the same eyes she saw every day in the mirror. The same defiance, the same air of secrecy that lingered in Emma's own thoughts, especially since the photo had gone viral. There was a bond between them, a connection that Emma had never been able to name before, but it was there. It was palpable in every inch of her bloodline, from her mother's cautious whispers to the silence surrounding the family's history. Emma turned the page, and there, again, was Clara. This time, she was standing outside a small, seemingly insignificant house on the outskirts of town. The house was familiar to Emma in a distant way, but she could not place it. It was a simple structure, nothing extravagant, yet its presence felt ominous in the photo. Her finger hovered over the image as her heart began to race. Clara had been linked to this house somehow, though Emma was sure her family had never spoken about it. The information she had uncovered at the Historical Society started to form a clearer picture. Clara's connection to the sheriff wasn't just incidental. Clara had been deeply involved in the social fabric of Cedar Valley at the time, and her influence extended well beyond the town's social circles. But that wasn't all. The deeper Emma dug, the more unsettling the discoveries became. The house in the photo, it turned out, was not just a place Clara had lived. There were whispers, deep in the town's forgotten corners, that it was also a place of rituals. People claimed that Clara was involved in occult practices, and that she had come into contact with entities or forces that weren't of this world. Emma had spent weeks combing through the records, each document only heightening her sense of dread. She had come across cryptic references to things her great-grandmother had written, journals, personal notes, old letters that hinted at a darker part of Clara's life. But one particular entry stood out among the rest. It was dated from the 1930s, when Clara would have been in her prime. In her journal, Clara spoke of an encounter with what she described as the Watcher. The entry was fragmented, but Emma could make out enough to understand the terror in Clara's words. Clara claimed that the Watcher had followed her for years, watching her every move. The words were chilling, each one etched in Clara's handwriting with a sense of urgency, as though she had been trying to warn someone, perhaps herself. It waits for me. It watches. It waits for my blood. And when the time is right, it will come for me. Emma's throat tightened as she read the final part of the entry. She wasn't sure what Clara had meant by this, whether she was referring to a metaphor, a real threat, or something far more sinister. But one thing was clear, the family's history was steeped in something far darker than Emma could have ever imagined. The realization that her great-grandmother had been involved in occult practices in some form terrified Emma, but the shock was compounded by the fact that Clara had always been portrayed as a respectable member of the community. Emma's family had always spoken of her with reverence, as though she were above reproach, a strong and wise woman who had kept the family together through tough times. What if they were wrong? What if the stories they had been told were carefully crafted to conceal a truth that had been buried for generations? That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The weight of what she had uncovered kept her awake, her mind racing. She couldn't understand how everything had been so carefully hidden, how the truth had been obscured for so long. The figure in the photo was no longer just a fluke, it was tied to something much older. As the town began to pick up on the connections between Clara and the strange events surrounding Emma's photo, the questions grew louder. People started to wonder if the figure was, in fact, Clara, or perhaps something else entirely. There were those who believed that the figure was a manifestation of Clara's spirit, a lingering presence that had returned to reclaim what it had left behind. In the midst of the growing hysteria, Emma tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She continued with her daily routine, caring for her children and going about her life, but everything felt different. The air felt thick with suspicion, and the town's once friendly demeanor had shifted into one of scrutiny. People watched her with wary eyes, whispering in hushed tones whenever she passed by. It wasn't just the media attention anymore. The entire town seemed to be holding its collective breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the next revelation. The photo had become a symbol, a touchstone for all the fear and uncertainty that had been simmering just beneath the surface of Cedar Valley. What had once been a quiet, peaceful town was now a place full of unanswered questions. And Emma, the person at the center of it all, found herself more isolated than ever. Her conversations with Daniel had grown strained. He had tried to be supportive, but even he couldn't deny the strain the whole situation was placing on their relationship. Every night, they lay awake in silence, unable to shake the feeling that something was coming. Daniel was no longer the steady, rational figure he once had been. His concern for Emma had started to turn into frustration, and the more she delved into Clara's past, the more he began to question her obsession. He didn't understand why Emma felt the need to continue uncovering the past when it was clear that doing so only made things worse. But Emma couldn't stop. She had to know the truth. It was the only way she could protect her children, protect herself, from whatever dark forces were still lingering in the shadows. And then, one night, the unthinkable happened. Emma received an anonymous letter. It was postmarked from Cedar Valley, but there was no return address, just a single line written in bold, jagged handwriting: "You are not safe. The Watcher is waiting for you." At first, Emma thought it was just another prank. But then the fear crept in. It wasn't just the words, it was the timing. The letter came after everything had already escalated: the photo, the rumors, the media frenzy. Someone knew more than they were letting on. Someone had been watching her. She could feel the weight of it, pressing on her chest like a constant reminder that the mystery of Clara's life, of the Watcher, was no longer just a story from the past, it was her reality. The figure in the photo, the mysterious presence, was real. And it was coming for her. Emma stared at the letter, her mind racing. What did this mean? Was it a warning? Or a threat? Who had sent it? And why? There were no answers, only more questions. But as Emma sat there, holding the letter in her trembling hands, one thing became crystal clear: the darkness that had haunted her family for generations was no longer confined to the past. It had found a way to reach into the present, and now it was coming for her. She had to act, and she had to act fast. But the more she tried to piece together the fragments of her family's past, the more she realized just how much was still hidden, how much had been buried in the town's deepest secrets. The figure in the photo wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. The real mystery was just unfolding, and Emma knew that if she didn't uncover the truth soon, the consequences could be far worse than she could ever imagine. The days following the letter felt like an endless blur of confusion, fear, and urgency. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had uncovered up until that point was leading her down a dark and winding path, one that she could no longer turn back from. The presence that had been lurking in the background of her family photo, what the media and townspeople had started calling the Watcher, was no longer just an anomaly or a theory. It was real, and it was coming for her. Emma knew that now. She could feel it deep in her bones. The weight of the past had finally caught up with her, and it wasn't something she could ignore anymore. The truth she had been desperately searching for had a life of its own, and the more she dug into her family's history, the more she realized that there were forces at play far beyond her control. As the days passed, the eerie feeling of being watched never left her. Emma found herself looking over her shoulder more often, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise whenever she stepped outside. The town, once a peaceful sanctuary for her family, now felt like a trap. The streets, the houses, even the trees, everything seemed to hide secrets, things that had been buried for far too long. It wasn't just the growing tension from the townspeople or the constant media attention that was weighing on her. It was the sense that there was something lurking in the shadows, something ancient and malevolent, that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. The anonymous letter, with its chilling warning, had only confirmed what Emma had feared for so long: the Watcher was not just a myth. It was real. It was late one evening, when the house was quiet and the children were fast asleep, that Emma made the decision. She couldn't sit idly by anymore, waiting for something to happen. She had to find out the truth, no matter what it cost her. She had already uncovered pieces of the puzzle: Clara's journals, the whispered rumors about the occult practices, the strange figure in the photo, but there was still so much left unanswered. The house from Clara's past, the one that had shown up in the old photo, held the key. Emma had to go there. She needed to see it for herself, to understand why it was so important and why it seemed to hold the answers to everything that had been haunting her family. The next morning, Emma packed a small bag and drove to the outskirts of town, where Clara's house stood. The road to the house was narrow, winding through thick trees and overgrown fields. As she drove, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every turn, every bend in the road, made her feel as though someone, or something, was just behind her, waiting. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady her nerves, but the closer she got to Clara's house, the more the air seemed to thicken. It felt like a storm was brewing on the horizon, a storm that was inevitable and unstoppable. When she finally arrived at the house, Emma was struck by its eerie presence. The structure was small, weathered by years of neglect. The wood of the house was cracked and faded, and the windows were dark and lifeless. It looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made Emma feel as though the house was still alive in some way. The silence around her was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the house itself was waiting for her, anticipating her arrival. Emma stepped out of the car and approached the house slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. She had heard the stories about Clara's connection to the house, but seeing it in person was something entirely different. She had expected to feel curiosity, maybe even a sense of excitement at the thought of uncovering more secrets. But all she felt now was fear. The house loomed in front of her, dark and imposing, as though it was watching her every move. The air around her felt thick with something ancient, a presence that she couldn't name but could feel deep inside her. She walked up the creaky steps to the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone, or something, was waiting for her to enter. Emma hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with doubts, but then she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she moved deeper into the house. It smelled of dust and decay, the scent of abandonment. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces blurred and faded with time. The air felt stagnant, as though the house had been trapped in time, waiting for something to change. Emma wandered through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence. It didn't take long before she found herself in the basement, the place where Clara's journals had mentioned strange rituals taking place. The stairs to the basement were steep and narrow, and the air grew colder with each step she took. The basement was dark, lit only by the faint light that filtered in from the small, high windows. The walls were lined with shelves, and scattered across the floor were old books, papers, and objects that Emma couldn't make sense of. But in the far corner of the room, there was something that caught her attention, a small wooden chest, tucked away under a dusty tarp. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached the chest. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it, as if the chest held the answers she had been searching for. With trembling hands, Emma lifted the tarp and opened the chest. Inside, she found an assortment of items, strange symbols etched into pieces of paper, small trinkets, and objects that seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. But it was the journals that caught her eye. There were several of them, all bound in leather, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. Emma carefully picked up one of the journals and opened it. The first entry was dated many years ago, from when Clara had first moved into the house. As Emma read the words, a chill ran down her spine. Clara's writing was frantic, filled with descriptions of visions, strange dreams, and encounters with a figure she called the Watcher. Clara wrote about the entity that had followed her for years, always watching, always waiting. It was inescapable, Clara wrote. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the Watcher's gaze. The words on the page seemed to blur together as Emma read, as if the journal itself was trying to keep its secrets hidden. One entry, in particular, made Emma stop. Clara wrote about a ritual, one that she had performed in the basement of the house, a ritual meant to banish the Watcher once and for all. But as Clara had written, the ritual didn't work. Instead, it seemed to have made things worse. The Watcher is stronger than I thought, Clara wrote. It is not just a presence, it is a force, something ancient. I have bound myself to it. I have called it into being. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she read those words. The Watcher wasn't just some spirit or ghost, it was something more, something much darker. And now, it seemed, Emma had inherited whatever Clara had called into being. She had opened the door to this dark force, and now it was following her, just as it had followed Clara. The ritual had failed, but the consequences of it had not. The Watcher was still here, still waiting. Suddenly, Emma felt a presence behind her. A cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner. The air had grown thick, heavy with an unseen pressure. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever before. She wasn't alone in the basement. With shaking hands, Emma closed the journal and backed away from the chest. She had to leave. She had to get out of there before whatever dark force had been awakened took hold of her completely. But as she turned to leave, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room plunged into darkness, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. She was trapped. She could feel it now, the presence that had been watching her for weeks, the force that had followed her from Clara's past. It was here, in the room with her, and it wasn't going to let her leave. The air seemed to pulse with energy, thick and suffocating. Emma's heart raced as she stumbled back toward the door, trying to pry it open. But it wouldn't budge. Her hands were shaking violently as she pulled on the door handle, but it was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. The darkness seemed to close in on her, and for the first time, Emma understood the full extent of the horror her great-grandmother had faced. The Watcher wasn't just a myth, it was real. And now, it had found her. Suddenly, the basement light flickered and then went out completely, plunging her into complete darkness. Her pulse raced as she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. She wasn't alone. The Watcher was there, and it was coming for her. With a final, desperate yank, Emma managed to tear the door open. She ran up the stairs as fast as she could, her breath ragged in her throat. She could hear the footsteps following her, getting closer, closer. Emma burst through the front door of the house, running into the cold night air, and didn't stop until she reached her car. She slammed the door shut, her hand still trembling as she started the engine and sped away from the house, leaving the darkness and the terror behind her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The Watcher was still out there, waiting. And the battle was just beginning. Emma didn't know how long she drove, her eyes blurred by tears and the haunting images that had flooded her mind in the wake of that night. The world outside the window passed by in a blur of shadows, the headlights of her car illuminating only fragments of the road ahead. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, her heart pounding with the terrifying realization that she had just come face to face with something beyond her understanding. The Watcher was real. And it wasn't done with her. She had barely escaped the house, but the darkness that had followed her down into the basement had seeped into her very soul. The presence had felt so tangible, so suffocating, as though the air itself had become a living thing, pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Every inch of her being screamed to run, to get away from whatever had been unleashed in Clara's house. The journal entries had made it clear, Clara had bound herself to the Watcher. And now Emma, unknowingly, had inherited the same dark force. Whatever Clara had started decades ago, Emma had unwittingly picked up where her great-grandmother left off. The ritual had failed. The Watcher had not been banished. Instead, it had only grown stronger. Emma's mind was a whirlwind of questions. How had this happened? Why her? Why had she been chosen? She wasn't a witch, she wasn't involved in any occult practices, she was just a mother, trying to protect her children, trying to keep her family safe. Yet now, she was entangled in a web of darkness, bound to a force she could not escape. As the car sped down the empty road, Emma's thoughts kept returning to her children. Ethan, Emma Jr., Olivia, and Noah, her precious babies. She had never imagined that her life would become a nightmare like this. They were too young to understand, too innocent to be dragged into the horrors that now haunted their mother. She had to protect them. She couldn't let them get caught up in the storm that was swirling around her. But how could she protect them from something she couldn't even understand? The town of Cedar Valley seemed so distant now, but Emma knew that the Watcher was still out there, watching, waiting. It wasn't just in the house anymore, it was following her. It had attached itself to her family, and it was only a matter of time before it found a way to make its presence felt again. Emma couldn't outrun it, and she couldn't hide from it. In a fit of desperation, Emma pulled into a small, dimly lit gas station on the outskirts of town. She parked the car and sat in silence, the engine humming softly, her hands trembling in her lap. The night was still, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of the highway and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. She knew she couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, she would have to confront the truth, face whatever dark force had latched onto her family. She couldn't live in fear. She had to fight back. But where could she turn for answers? She had already dug into Clara's past, read her journals, uncovered the occult rituals and the chilling encounters with the Watcher, but it hadn't been enough. The more she learned, the more questions piled up. It wasn't enough to know the history of the curse that had followed her family, it wasn't enough to understand the rituals and the symbols Clara had used. Emma needed help. She needed someone who understood this kind of darkness, someone who could help her break free. And then it hit her. There was someone. Someone who might have the answers. Her Aunt Mary. Emma had almost forgotten about her aunt's warning, the phone call that had set everything in motion. Mary had known something. She had hinted at things that Emma hadn't fully understood at the time. She had mentioned the Watcher, but there had been something in her voice that told Emma there was more to the story, something her aunt had been holding back. Maybe Mary knew how to end this, how to break the curse that had plagued their family for generations. With newfound determination, Emma reached for her phone and dialed her aunt's number. The phone rang 3 times before Mary picked up, her voice soft, but filled with the same urgency Emma had heard in her earlier message. "Emma? What's happened? Are you okay?" Mary's voice was filled with concern, and Emma could hear the faint tremor in her aunt's words. It was as if Mary knew exactly what had happened, even though Emma hadn't said a word. "I'm not okay, Aunt Mary," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. "I went to Clara's house. The one in the photo. The Watcher, it's real. It followed me. It's in my head, and I don't know how to stop it. Please, you have to help me. You know something, don't you? You've known all along." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Emma could hear her aunt's steady breathing, as if she were collecting her thoughts, preparing herself for something difficult. "I should have told you sooner, Emma," Mary said, her voice quieter now. "But I didn't want to scare you. I didn't know how you would handle the truth. You weren't ready for it. I've been trying to protect you from this, but I can't anymore. It's time you knew the whole story." Emma's pulse quickened as she leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean? What story?" Mary sighed deeply, as if the weight of years of silence had finally become too much to bear. "Your great-grandmother Clara wasn't just involved in occult practices, Emma. She didn't just dabble in dark rituals. She was the one who opened the door. The Watcher isn't just some entity, it's a force. A primordial being that has been around for centuries. It doesn't belong to this world. And Clara, in her desperation, tried to control it, tried to bind it to herself. But she failed. The Watcher isn't something you can control. It's a parasite, a dark presence that feeds on fear, on pain. And once it attaches itself to a family, it never lets go." Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine as her aunt continued, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. "Clara thought she could protect herself by performing a ritual," Mary continued, her voice trembling. "But she was wrong. The Watcher didn't just disappear. It became part of her. It became part of our family, passed down from generation to generation. And now, it's come for you, Emma. It's come for your children, because it knows you're the last one who can break the cycle." Emma's head was spinning. She could hardly process what Mary was saying. "But how do I stop it? How do I break this curse? How do I keep my children safe?" Mary's voice softened. "There's a way, Emma. There's a ritual, an ancient one. But it's not easy. It requires a sacrifice, something that will sever the bond between the Watcher and your family. You have to confront it, face it directly, and force it back into the void where it belongs. It's the only way to end this, once and for all." Emma's heart raced. "What kind of sacrifice? What do I have to do?" Mary was quiet for a moment, as if she were weighing her words carefully. "It's not a physical sacrifice, Emma. It's a spiritual one. You have to confront the Watcher in the place where it all began, Clara's house. You have to stand there, alone, and face it. You have to accept the darkness, embrace it, and then push it away. You'll need to perform the ritual exactly as Clara did, but this time, you'll succeed. You'll need a focus, something that represents everything the Watcher feeds on, the fear, the pain, the darkness. And then you'll have to destroy it." Emma's mind was racing, trying to absorb what her aunt was saying. The idea of confronting the Watcher, of standing face to face with the entity that had haunted her family for generations, was terrifying. But it was the only way. For her children. For her family. She had to do it. Where do I begin? Emma asked, her voice steady despite the terror she felt inside. Mary gave her the final instructions, the ancient words to speak, the objects she would need to perform the ritual. Emma's heart felt heavy as she absorbed every detail. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be without risk. But she was determined. She had to break the cycle, for herself and for her children. As she ended the call with her aunt, Emma realized that this was the moment that would define everything. She was no longer just a mother trying to protect her family from something she didn't understand. She was now part of something much larger, something much darker. And she was going to have to face it head-on, no matter the cost. The Watcher was coming for her, but this time, Emma was ready to fight back.